Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative Director, Ms. Clara Jordan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Yesterday, we had a really great day. We heard from the Prime Minister, a 4-star general, a 3-star general, the Secretary of State, and a slew of thought leaders that are shaping the policies, technology, and public perception in the information security space. We have another great day in front of us. After the 2 speakers tomorrow talking about the recent threat developments, we'll have Minister Zagorski, the Polish Minister of Digitization. We'll have our Digital Forensic Lab demo later this afternoon after lunch. They will talk to you about how they uncover and explain this information. So I hope you'll enjoy today as well. It is my pleasure to invite to stage Kenneth Geers. He's right there. He will talk about some of the recent threat trends in this region. Kenneth is a long-term fellow at the Atlantic Council, I would say since 2013. He's been a part of the Cyber Statecraft initiative, so it's my pleasure to welcome you to the stage, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, good morning. Well, it's so nice to be here. Always an honor to be in this part of the world. I've spent about 6 of the last 12 years in Estonia or Ukraine, so I'm very fond of this space. And I do think that it sounds cliche, but we're at a very historic moment, I think, in regional politics and regional threats. Now that the EU and NATO should be mature and have proven their worth and value to the world, it seems like they're in question, right? Are we going to continue to support these things? And the tools that will be used on either side of the debate are, of course, more powerful than any tools and weapons that we've known before. And above all, I'm talking about information technology. So information technology, not just the use of it, but the abuse of it for geopolitical ends, right? How do you collect information? How do you disseminate information and receive it, process it? All of those are subject to attack, right, and to compromise. And it's very important that, for example, even the basics of attack be understood. There's denial. There's three basic forms of cyber attack, right? There's denial of service. In other words, I deny you information. And there's also manipulation of information, right? Which is the most difficult to perhaps perceive and comprehend. Right, so I can steal your information, I can block information, or I can manipulate information. And I think what I want to talk about a little bit is the impact on Poland and NATO, right, and the European Union as well. But here we are. They've given me the topic of regional perspective, and I think there's so much to talk about and to appreciate. So we'll start in the 1500s. I just have a few slides with Ivan the Terrible. Right, and Ivan the Terrible is currently undergoing a rehabilitation in Russia. Right, so even Ivan the Terrible, even Stalin, these are powerful figures in mythology. Right, so it's very important that Russia rehabilitate these characters. If the narrative of what Putin, for example, wants to promulgate as the raison d'etre, as the mission of Moscow and the Kremlin be appreciated and understood by those within the country and outside. But what we do know of Ivan the Terrible was that his name came from spilling a lot of blood, right? Including that of his son, which provides a terrible metaphor for perhaps Russian politics as a whole, right? The incredible sadness with which you destroy your own political system. However, but what we can see in Russia is an effort to guard the the name and the meaning of great myths in Russian history and in terms of geography, Orthodox religion, etc. And it begins there. Now this is a step forward, not just a family squabble or the pacification of Siberia, but the bureaucratization of the use or the monopoly on the use of force and violence within a political territory. So secret police, this is the Okhrana, right? So there was the Obrechniki, and then there was this, and there's the KGB, and it's always going to evolve. But it's a systematic use of or a bureaucratization of violence. And that's also, a big part of it is information. So the control of information, but also the threat of the misuse of information. And so, for example, friends of mine in Ukraine, when they speak on the phone with relatives in Russia, they just avoid politics, right? They know there's no point. One, Russian propaganda is very powerful, but two, they're always assuming that someone is listening, right? So you can imagine IT in the hands of secret police, right? Secret police basically is covert police action, right? Behind the scenes, often outside of the rule of law, but it's specific for a political party, right, or a person. So when we think about Pravda, there's no truth in news, there's no news in truth, right? This is, people are not stupid. They can see in a newspaper, politicians are very good at this, using language that doesn't mean anything, right? We are going to explore this initiative, right? Or calling a missile a peacemaker, for example. Without passing too much judgment, you can do anything you want with language. Recently in Kansas City, there was an effort to develop a regional development park, right? Well, when citizens asked what the regional development park was, it was a landfill, right? A trash dump, right? That somebody had thought, this is the way to get it through the bureaucracy and past citizens. So it's part of politics everywhere. But when you think about the power of a government to control and to disseminate information, and just imagine this now in the IT space, right? And what Orwell, when you think of doublespeak, when you think of telescreens, this is putting all of this right into your pocket, right? All of us now have a supercomputer in our pocket and social media with which we can be targeted, not as a group, but as an individual. So I was really lucky in 2007, I was cyber division chief at NCIS, like the TV show, and I got a call from the Pentagon and they said, will you go to Estonia and write a report on the unfolding cyber attack in Estonia. And then I didn't leave for 4 years after that. We built this think tank on cybersecurity in Tallinn. And if you've already forgotten this story, it's quite interesting. But it's a simple story of geopolitics seen in cyberspace. So cyberspace is only a reflection of the real world. So questions like, the future of Polish politics and the future of NATO, etc., these are all played out on the digital domain. And when Wired magazine called this Web War I, it was really the first time that geopolitics or a coercion attempt by one state over another, was truly seen. Right? You're going to take actions such as move this statue that we don't like. Well, we're going to take down your media, your government, your ISPs, your banks through simple denial of service attacks. And if you don't know what, for example, a defacement is, this is 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's when you just change the web page, to something you don't like. So this was the first example, kind of like Ivan the Terrible, first doing a political control over Russian territory. This is the first attempt by a government to really attack and punish another. This is Maidan in the beginning of 2014 in Ukraine. And just 7 years after the first big cyber attack, the nature and scope of cyber war had evolved considerably, a day and night difference. You think about all the things that happened in the Ukraine case. The US diplomats had their telephone communications captured by traditional SIGINT, uploaded to YouTube and announced on Twitter, right? This is a multifaceted use of computer technology for geopolitical purpose. On the political side, the hackers had taken control of the Ukrainian presidential election website, and as soon as the polls closed, a far-right candidate was announced the winner, and this was immediately announced on Russian television, also suggesting a coordinated operation. And social media, of course, there's attacks. My students in Kiev, I taught university there for 2 years, they would say they see information operations every day within their social media space. In business, smart TVs, e-billboards were attacked for propaganda. And then the most important thing was in really, from a national security perspective, in critical infrastructure. So the railways, the airport, also, most importantly, the electricity grid. Everything depends on electricity, but because everything now is dependent on the proper functioning of IT, even electricity now is dependent on information technology and cyber attacks being prevented, right? And so, but what was demonstrated in Ukraine is that unknown attackers literally can turn off the electrical power, and then nothing else works, right? So, so this is not far from Poland, but really Estonia and Ukraine have both played significant roles in the history of cyber warfare, and they couldn't really be closer. So, again, at the strategic level, kind of like the discussion on Pravda, and putting that in every Soviet citizen's hands for 7 decades, you know, that's the highest level of rhetoric and use of important political terminology to, you know, to either defend your position or attack another. You know, so already we can see that computer hacking, as well as the use of social information operations in social media, they're going after the most important, the top targets, you know, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, etc., but also questions like the European Union, its importance, its role and value, and NATO. And of course, for Poland, this is really very, very important because not only these questions play a fundamental role in the nature of Poland and its future, but specifically for European and international security, right? So the bigger the prize, the more effort will be put into it. And today, that's really information technology and the use of information technology for political purposes. So those are all the slides that I have, but what I want to suggest is that cyber war is very much a thing. If you heard General Alexander speak, he agreed. I asked him, do you believe in cyber war? And he said, oh yeah, I have experience in cyber war. The hacking, computer hacking, will probably not decide a strategic war, right, between nations. But I believe that it can, in fact, decide battles, right? And battles make up wars. So questions of Polish politics today and whether to support NATO or whichever side you're on, the tools have never been more powerful. So information technology puts all this power in your pocket as well as the president or prime minister. And so each of us has an important role to play, both in the use and watching for the abuse of information technology. Thank you. Pass the mic. Sure. That's...
Hello? Oh, thank you. Now I want to introduce Christopher Porter. He's the Chief Intelligence Strategist at the cybersecurity company FireEye and another senior fellow at the Statecraft initiative at the Atlantic Council. Chris is going to talk about China and some other global actors. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Clara. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. China and some other stuff. That's the topic of my presentation today. As Clara said, I'm the Chief Intelligence Strategist at FireEye. What is that? That means I do stuff like this. Non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. That means they don't pay me for my input, so perhaps you're going to get what they're paying for. Clara did ask me when she invited me, could I talk about some things that were a little bit different? You know, it's the start of the second day. Can we say some controversial things? I'm going to say as many somewhat controversial things as I can in about 10 minutes. That will both allow me to claim credit if any of my predictions are correct without having to answer the substance of any of your objections. But if you would like to ask questions, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Dr. Geers and I have both said a lot of interesting stuff. If you're not satisfied and you want to bully me more, certainly I'll be here all day and we can discuss any of the issues that I'm going to mention at length. So a couple things that are different. I was a little concerned because about a third of my presentation is about China, and I said, well, will anybody in Poland care about Chinese threats? I think that worked out super well, actually. So we're going to talk about their economic espionage, mostly drawing on the U.S. experience. I don't want to, make the entire presentation about the U.S. I do because I'm from the U.S., but we will try and center it in Europe, but building on the U.S. experience. I also want to talk about proliferation. As an old arms control guy, maybe proliferation's not quite the right word, but I think it's the right idea. How do cyber tools and weapons and capabilities spread from country to country, and how does that affect the threat perspective that Poland should have? We'll look at supply chain. Here I'm talking about software supply chain. I'm a software guy, so the sort of hardware questions you may have, feel free to ask, but this is really about software supply chain. And then artificial intelligence. I didn't have time for blockchain, so I just went with one buzzword, artificial intelligence. But I do think, especially building on what Dr. Geers said about informationized, sort of war, public perception war, this is going to be, I think, the, reagent that gets a lot of that going. So what's the U.S. experience with Chinese economic espionage? Okay, so I'm in the private sector. I have every incentive to say that the threat from China across all possible measures is higher than ever because in general that's a good thing for us to do, right? So when I say that the threat to the U.S. went down at least for a period of time, I hope that you'll believe that at least I believe that because I have every incentive to say the opposite. Why did it go down? September 2015, Presidents Xi and Obama met. They signed a non-binding but a bilateral agreement, a range of topics. We only care about the cyber issues that they discussed. They agreed not to use state resources, APTs, General Alexander's people, to steal intellectual property from one another's companies for commercial purposes. Whenever you read like a headline in the newspaper and it says China didn't ever obey this agreement and they cheated it all along and it was a bad idea to sign it, the people writing those articles usually don't take into account the part of the agreement that says for commercial purposes. This really was a very narrow norm that the U.S. was trying to establish, extremely narrow. I just think if we're going to call out bad behavior all the time, we also ought to call out good behavior. And for the most part, Beijing did live up to their obligations. More important is that the agreement comes at the end of this big downturn here. That's September 2015, is the bottom of the curve, meaning that China had already been drawing down their operations, stealing intellectual property from the United States before the agreement. So it's okay to be skeptical, can diplomatic agreements really restrain people in cyberspace? But what this really was a chance to lock in gains that were already happening, mostly driven by internal Chinese politics. They want to be an innovation leader, not a follower. If you're constantly stealing intellectual property, you're also choking off your own innovators. They want their patents respected. And more to the point, the beginning of that big curve on the right is where the U.S. threatened, when you come to Washington, you're going to sign this agreement or we're going to, push a big WTO trade case. So it's not entirely a benevolent behavior by Beijing, but it's a result of a larger bilateral relationship. Cyber, very important, but still, for most issues, secondary to more direct conventional military power, more direct economic power. I think this reflects that. You have these bigger factors going on. As you can see on the right, as their operations are going down, these are known attributed Chinese groups that we know from doing the investigations stole commercial intellectual property, not dual use, not defense. So these are, unambiguous cases of intellectual property theft. On the right, you can see Chinese investment deals in the US going up roughly in the same shape. So part of why they stopped stealing so much intellectual property from the US is that they were just buying the companies or requiring them to transfer it as part of the price of doing business in China. Perhaps you could also say that they had other sources for collecting the intellectual property. I think you've seen that in some of the legal cases filed in the US, but still deserve a lot of credit for meeting their direct cyber-related obligations for non-dual use, non-military technology. Very narrow, but I think they still did it. What else have they been doing instead? Well, if I made a chart like this for Europe, the curve would be almost exactly the opposite. And FireEye has customers all over the world, you know, almost half of the global Fortune 2000, 60% or so of the US Fortune 500. So I think our view of things, you know, pretty well reflects objective reality. But if I made a curve like this for Europe, it'd be almost exactly the opposite, right? So they stop robbing US auto manufacturers, they get the same thing from a European counterpart. Or they stop stealing, perhaps in some cases even, they move some of their dual-use technology theft from the US, maybe to a partner in Japan or India or somewhere else. So it's not that they're not doing it, it's that there was this bigger bilateral issue that they were concerned about, and they backed off of that while still meeting their obligations to steal what they needed to steal. At the same time that's happening, they're also changing the shape of how they get at what they get at. So they're going after cloud providers, managed security providers they've been doing for a long time, since at least 2014, but the ratio, the amount of which they would do that certainly went up. Stealing a lot of information that's not intellectual property. So the Xi agreement does say you also won't steal business confidential information, but that's almost anything that espionage is. So for the most part, that wasn't really enforced until the Trump administration. They stole mergers and acquisitions information, anything that would give their companies a leg up on competition. And I think that's the part that's most relevant for Poland. Yes, they would still steal intellectual property. They will definitely steal information that will help them outcompete your businesses here and abroad. So I think that's what you really want to focus on. Also, a shift towards military, political, you know, traditional intelligence collection that, again, you want to stop, you know, governments want to stop that, but it's not norm violating, right? So, what does this look like in Europe? If you're China, you've got sort of, you know, rough equivalent, maybe like the Marshall Plan. You have the Belt and Road Initiative. You're building out infrastructure, you're building out trade relationships, starting clockwise from your southeast ports, moving through Southeast Asia, moving through the Horn of Africa, eventually ending up in the ports in northern Germany, and then going back across the old Silk Road. So a lot of what they're doing with their espionage operations, I would say it's essentially checking up on their investments. They give a country, you know, $1 billion or billions of dollars. They want to know how the local government is spending it. They want to know what else other international firms from other countries are doing in that country. So they want to outcompete every other country in the world where they are making investments in the Belt and Road Initiative. Obviously, that's going to affect all of Europe, Poland as well. They're going to want to check up on their investments, particularly infrastructure investments. They're also going to want their companies to win these contracts. That's not unusual. The U.S. is probably, if not alone, it's one of the countries that has the least relationship between government intelligence collection and private companies for legal reasons in the U.S. Almost every other country does this to some degree, so I'm not passing moral judgment on what the Chinese are doing. But they do have a lot of apparatus behind this, and it's important for you to understand that. This is overall Chinese activity. These are not all the groups that we follow, but these are some interesting ones. So at the same time, you see, you know, the Xi agreement being signed there at we'll say Q4 2015. You also have internal to China the reorganization of their cyber forces from PLA and PLA Navy and so forth to one big apparatus, the Strategic Support Force, reporting ultimately directly to President Xi. So you've got a number of different things going on. Like any bureaucracy, you know, you've got a new boss, you've got a new organization, you've got to unplug your computer and move it to a different office, you've got different orders, where's your paycheck coming from, where's the new cafeteria. So there was a drawdown in activity that coincided with I would say the effect of the diplomatic agreement, but was separate from it. So this includes military and political intelligence collection. This is everything. This is also worldwide, not just the US. You can see there was also a big drawdown. What's interesting is you look at a group like Temp Periscope. If you had asked me in 2015, what did Temp Periscope do? I would say that they stole information, military political information, that was directly naval related. They were a naval intelligence collector. But when they came back up in 2017, and certainly going into 2018, they're very active, they weren't just a naval military intelligence collector, they were also one of the groups checking up on Chinese investments in various ports in Southeast Asia, right? So at some point, somebody said, you're really good at stealing, shipping-related information, naval port-related information. Why don't you do that for our economic development plan as well? They're using their traditional so it goes both ways. They used a lot of what were their economic espionage collectors to start doing military intelligence, but they also did the opposite, right? This is a very deliberately vague example, but it's based on a real case study. The 4 companies here that this Chinese APT group compromised in order to get what was ultimately, defense-related information, but contractor A that they compromised, big defense contractor or systems integrator. But from there, they looked at their supply chain and went after companies B, C, and D over the course of several years. And the interesting thing to me is that what they stole from, for example, from Company C didn't really consider it to be sensitive. It wasn't their business competitive information, it wasn't classified, but you couldn't make the product that they were trying to counterfeit or copy without that information. Do you see what I'm saying? Company C didn't really care that much about protecting what was stolen from them, but the Chinese cared a lot about getting it. And they only knew about that particular manufacturing artifact because they had already compromised Company A. So I think you'll see a lot of that, something for Poland to think about as you partner with the US and NATO on joint defense development, accepting high technology goods, creating your own goods and trying to get them integrated back into the alliance. You have to think not only about what is sensitive to you that you've developed, but also what could be useful to another country or an adversary if they could integrate that in with other things that they're stealing. You've got to see it from the adversary's perspective. APT 37, so North Korean group. Until very recently, if you made a chart of where North Korea was active, it'd be like 80% South Korea, 5%, 10% Japan, and about the same in the US. The language barrier is the big barrier for a lot of North Korean operations more than anything. What are they doing in the Middle East? Well, South Korea is in the Middle East. So they're checking up not only on their immediate proximate geographical rivals, but also what they're doing elsewhere in the world. This pattern of APT groups going after not only their immediate neighbors, who they've been at war with or whatever, not only checking up on them, but what they're doing elsewhere in the world, I think you're going to see a lot more of that. And the reason I mention that is it's going to lead to a lot of non-obvious targeting. There's going to be a lot of what Poland may deal with where you ask, what is, country, why are they trying to get into our networks? They may not even care about Poland. They may care about a totally unrelated country that's doing business here. That's not necessarily a surprise to a lot of people, but it's not just going to be the big players in the world that do this. This is going to move down the chain to the second and third tier cyber actors. And North Korea, over the last several years, they started using 0 days of their own, the sort of technology that 10 years ago you would have said, China, Russia, US, other major countries, the UK, they would have 0 days. Nobody else could afford to do it. We've seen that move down. North Korea is developing some of their own original 0 days, and I think you'll see that spread as well. In terms of industrial control systems, this is a very particular subfield, and it's not mine, but just an observation that I want to share is that every time you defend one layer of this, if you start off defending the IT networks, then the guys who were doing the critical infrastructure attack, move down a level. You defend that, now they're moving to the supervisory systems. You stop the supervisory systems, now they're on the actual, boards controlling the physical plant equipment, and they're manipulating things in memory, right? So every level you defend, the attackers are moving down another level, and I don't think we've gotten a good handle on that yet. Software supply chain threats. FireEye, we were aware of 5 of these last year by nation-state groups, which is where they're getting into the update process of some major piece of software. They're compromising someone's source code at the source and then getting that into your system. So they don't care about the target they're on. They want to get into your secure network, and so they're looking and figuring out where you're getting your software, where you're getting your updates from. The concerning thing about this is that, A, it works and it's very hard to stop. A lot of times the applications that are being compromised, you have them whitelisted. So even if they generate some kind of an error, you're going to go, oh, well, that's just whatever bank. That's just the software that everybody in our industry uses. You'll push through and continue to download the update. We had 5 last year. We only had, 3 or 4 in the previous decade. And I think there's enough public examples of this that you're going to get a lot of imitators, criminal groups, nation-state groups. Already it's a major focus, but I think you're going to see it a lot more in the year ahead. AI-based threats, we're always on a little bit of a lag when we talk about what's new and what's current, because companies may not even know they've been compromised for a year, year and a half, and then you do a 6-month investigation. So you're always on a little bit of a lag. But I bet when we look back on late 2018, early 2019, we're going to realize that major threat groups are already doing this. They've already been successful doing this. We just haven't discovered it yet. Particularly, I think, with fake audio. So doing deep fakes, but not just for video, but for audio. CEO impersonation, where you pretend to be a commander of a military force or something like that. Everybody clicks on those emails, very hard to stop. Now imagine getting a voicemail or a phone call from your boss's boss and he tells you to click on that email. Even if you feel like something's wrong, that's very hard to stop. Psychologically, a lot of people will click on that. And of course, there's the information operations side of it as well that Dr. Geers talked about. But I think even just for straightforward network operations, probably this is already happening and we just haven't found it yet. I think the technology is so widely available, I think it must be happening already. Grab bags. So these are the things that I don't have time to talk about, but I want credit for. If I had to pick, just out of a hat, if I read in the news, if Alexa starts reading me the news and it says there's been a major critical infrastructure attack, my Bayesian prior is going to be that it was a railway attack. I think particularly in Europe, we see a lot of groups researching attacks on railways. Poland already suffered one from a non-state act, sort of accidentally or incidentally, but once you have one that happens from a real non-state actor, now you've got plausible deniability for doing it if you want to fake it. Creating fake data for election interference, kind of the same concern. People know, people in this room maybe know that deep fakes are possible and that you should discount that. But does the general public know? Or even if you know that it's fake, if you see the video, doesn't it still have an effect on how you view that person? The Olympics coming up, I think that's a major target. Those are always a major target, so that's not much of a prediction. But I think there's going to be a lot of effort there. And finally, I would just say changes in China's economic espionage behavior, particularly for the U.S., but for its allies as well. As trade tensions continue, a lot of the economic logic behind them reducing their operations sort of goes away, right? Remember, the big drawdown in their operations happened when there was the threat of a WTO complaint. If you're already living in that world of heightened trade tensions, maybe there's not so much of an incentive to not steal that intellectual property. So I have no idea how I'm doing on time since we started late, but those are all my remarks. So.
Thank you, Chris. Kenneth, can you please join Chris on the stage for a couple of questions? And I'll give the audience a couple of minutes to think about their. Oh, there's already one question, so I'll save mine for later. Ambassador Szczegel.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to thank both speakers for their excellent presentations. I was inspired by Kenneth's presentation about this Russian attitude to the information and the tendency to weaponize information. And I think in Poland we experience, not recently, but for many years, something that could be called battle or war for memory, on memory, related to history. And as you know, history is an important part of Russian identity. So they devote particular attention to those elements of history that constitute a kind of backbone of Russian imperialism, Russian pride, national pride. And what we face in recent years is a growing, very intensive campaign to actually distort the facts related to history of Polish-Russian relations. And as you know, the history of those relations is very long, very intensive from time to time. In most cases, those attempts are directed not only or predominantly not targeting Polish audience, but Russian audience. So they use the picture of foreign adversary, enemy, in order to consolidate domestic support for the current leadership. Few examples. What everybody here in Poland knows, those controversies related to the monuments dedicated to the Red Army that we have in Poland. Quite recently we adopted the legislation that is requesting the removal of symbols of totalitarian regimes from the open space, including symbols like red stars and so on. So this is the basis for the decisions taken by local authorities to remove or move actually those remaining monuments, for example, from main squares in the towns to cemeteries that are also located in the neighborhood. But Russia is using this legislation in order to create a kind of campaign of hysteria, accusing Poland of, on one hand, that we are not cherishing the memory of the liberators who liberated Poland in their understanding from the German occupation during the Second World War, and they are trying also to picture or depict Poland as a country that is not gratitude enough, yes, that is not protecting this memory. And actually this is mainly for the either domestic consumption or it is a very popular element of the English-speaking Russian media, like Russia Today, for example. So what we face is a very aggressive campaign of Russian state structures. They are trying to actually distort the real facts related to history, and very interesting element. You know what Russia celebrates on the 4th of November? This is the day of Russian unity, Dzień Narodowego Jedinstwa. This is the anniversary of the liberation of Moscow from Polish invaders in 1612. So it was established by Tsar Mikhail Romanov in 1613, on the first anniversary actually. Then it was celebrated, commemorated until the October Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, and was refreshed again by Putin in 2005. So in order to give the public something to celebrate. So, well, we can be proud that we are the only nation able to occupy Kremlin, yes? So for us it's a kind of important moment in our history. But at the same time, you know, they accuse many countries, not only Poland, but for example, Baltic states. You know, this story of Forest Brothers, so the resistance, military resistance movement after the end of Second World War in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. So they are trying to depict this movement that was resisting Soviet occupation as a kind of post-fascist elements. And probably many of you visited Moscow, yes, and Red Square. Do you remember this monument on the Red Square? No? This monument dedicated to Minin and Pożarski. So those were the leaders of this anti-Polish revolt in 1612. So this is the element of the Russian national memory. So we should be able really to counter this narrative that is so strongly promoted by Russia, that is also mainly targeting countries of this part of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, in order to disarm actually Russian propaganda, who is using some sentiments that always used to exist, you know, presenting them as liberators, those who are the main driving force against fascism, and those who brought freedom and liberty to Europe. Actually, in this part of Europe, it was neither freedom nor liberty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for providing that important context for our audience. I have two questions. One was right here.
Hello, Kamil Kamiński, PKO BP. Well, I have actually two questions. First of all, so is the biggest threat to NATO China in terms of cybersecurity? Because I was quite concerned about Russia, but after after those graphs, I need to rethink my approach.
I was told to do everything except for regional issues. So.
Oh, okay, so it's the first question, and the second is because I know that you are based in Berlin or affiliated with Berlin, and so when I speak with German CEOs, they complain about Chinese investment, they complain about Chinese stealing the intellectual property. However, is there any government strategy which is being nowadays created? I haven't heard anything, but it's because, you know, Germany plays quite a big role in Europe and NATO. Are they working closely with US on, you know, changing the perspective in terms of cybersecurity? Because we all know that there is a problem with terrorism, there is a problem with Russia, but in terms of China, how does it play in Germany? Thank you.
Well, I think one of the things with both China and Russia is that there's quantity and quality of information. As we discovered, I spent years in the Pentagon trying to do attribution of the Chinese cyber attacks closer to the year 2000. And what we discovered was there's the quantity and quality of attacks and code and et cetera. But quantity has a quality all its own, right? And China, being this very large country that was growing so quickly, had this booming economy, and especially in the early days of cyber espionage, fully took advantage of stealing data. So the number one thing is data theft, right? There's theft, denial, and manipulation, but theft dominates the landscape. So the United States, as well as Germany, I think, have been the victim of cyber espionage to an incredible degree because of the existing industrial infrastructure. Right? But as China grows, of course, then it's going to want to protect its own patents and copyrights and for the future. And so that's in part why I think we see a decline.
I wanted to build a little bit, just because your comments made me think about it. Another trend that certainly you're familiar with in this region, but I think it bears really drawing out why. Yes, data theft has always been the big player because these are tools that came out of the intelligence and espionage world. But I think we're entering an era in which the default assumption of how cyber is used is going to be more militarized, right? More overt, more open. You said quantity has a quality of its own, but more willingness to do direct attack or modification of data. We see cyber criminals doing that already, but certainly I think governments, including the US with its allies, sharing tools at a military level, that's a big change, moving this out of the shadows, from where each nation had its own capabilities that were rarely shared, and now talking about, well, how can alliance members do this together? Certainly that's not just the US and its allies in NATO, but Russia's going to look to do that with its allies. China will look to do that with its allies and so forth, Iran and so forth. Every major player in cyberspace is now moving towards militarization of these tools. And I think that's a very dangerous precedent that will change the shape. You know, theft will probably always be the biggest player by its nature, but a lot of what's been technologically possible in the past hasn't been done because countries were sort of uncertain how that would upset the status quo. Would using a cyber tool in an attack, a true like kinetic attack capability sense, what kind of response would that provoke? Nobody knew for sure, and they still don't really know at a large scale. So you see these tools being tested out in war zones, but you don't really see them used between major players at peace. And I think that's something that we'll see change over the next few years. The sharing amongst alliances of cyber tools, militarization of cyber tools will change the shape. So it's not just theft anymore. You'll see more manipulation and more attack in the sense not of denial of service, but of having real world consequences.
Thank you. And I'll just ask one follow-up question, Chris, because you talked a lot about what you see with your clients. What are you seeing in a banking sector in the United States? What are, if that's something you can share, what are some of the trends you're seeing, you know, in the U.S. banking sector?
Yeah, obviously banks are some, and this is true in Poland as well, some of the best defended. You know, by the nature, the banks that aren't well defended don't exist or, you know, wouldn't last long. So there's a heavy investment there. And in the U.S., as in Poland, the financial sector are often the leaders in cybersecurity. On the other hand, it's a sector where reputation and availability are at a premium. You know, if you're down for even a little bit, that causes like a loss of confidence, not just in your bank, but in all banks. I'm concerned that, particularly with North Korea willing to go after SWIFT-connected banks, willing to rob large amounts of money, you know, those are things that many countries could do and historically have been afraid to do so. Well, why was North Korea willing to do that and still doing that in the Western Hemisphere? A big part of the reason why is that when you're so sanctioned and isolated, there's no longer anything else to do short of actual military conflict. You can't isolate them from the financial sector anymore, so there's no blowback to doing it. I think that's a concern that that Poland and that the U.S. should keep in mind as we consider sanctions on these countries. It's not going to be cost-free to do that forever. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I am more skeptical than many people, but I think for the financial sector, we see a lot of institutions in the U.S. Sort of bracing for potential impact as sanctions ratchet up on a variety of countries. I think everyone kind of knows that there's a risk of retribution from those countries, and that their version of counter-sanctioning might not be restricting access to their currency. It might be manipulating your bank records, you know, manipulating your ability to do repo arrangements, manipulating or just directly assaulting the availability of your app, even maybe not the bank records, but maybe the app on the phone can be taken down more easily. So you're going to get trapped, as a bank, you're going to get trapped in the larger geopolitics of your nation. I think that's true in the U.S. and Poland as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, then I have one last one, which I'm really interested in. You know, 5 years ago, we didn't really think Iran was a big threat, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Let's do a little bit of foresight. Who do you think is the next big actor? What are some of the countries you kind of see out there getting at the level with Iran, North Korea, and some others? And then what are the sectors we should be worrying about in the next decade, let's say?
Part of the problem with cybersecurity is that one, as Bruce Schneier mentioned, code is very vulnerable. But then on a military level, most operations fly under what's called the use of force. So in international law, what does that mean? Nobody dies, right? So if nobody dies, nobody really cares. And most computer network operations can be justified as espionage, as justified for national defense, to collect intelligence, to understand your adversaries, etc. And so that makes this space very open to not only data theft, but data manipulation, right? Because if I'm in position to read your email, I can also change your email, right? Which, again, that's not going to lead to war, probably. So I do think that some of the powers that we haven't heard of yet, because the intelligence community and the FireEyes of the world don't have enough time to look at everything, right? So if it's a power in the traditional space, you will see them probably already active in cyberspace. We just haven't had time to decipher it and to report on it yet, because even the intelligence community has limited personnel and time to look at everything. So Iran is definitely one of them.
I would say that there are a lot of ongoing cyber conflicts that fly under the radar in the West. You know, countries in Southeast Asia going after each other, for example. You're right about the resource constraint, but even the ones we do know about, it just doesn't get picked up in the West. So I think policymakers don't think about it, even though it's already happening. I'm very concerned because all the major cyber incidents that we've had so far between states have involved at least one major power, right? The US, Russia, China, one big country doing something that another doesn't like. And there's, you know, a century at least of other outlets of getting out of those bilateral conflicts, right? Resolving those, working towards peace, not letting them spiral out of control. What happens when two small countries that have been fighting wars with each other for centuries discover one another in their military networks? Is that espionage, or is that a prep to disable their ability to issue commands? What if those two countries have nuclear weapons? Is the other country in your network because they want to know when you're prepping for a nuclear launch, or are they trying to disable your ability to launch a second strike? How do you respond to that? Maybe you move tactical control of your nukes to the field. There's a lot, there are many fewer outlets and lower trust among regional powers that are competing with one another than there are for the sort of global cyber powers hacking each other and one another's allies. I could actually see, international law aside, I could actually see one of those conflicts spilling out into armed conflict, even if somebody doesn't die. I think that's a much greater likelihood than the great cyber powers having that happen to each other. So that doesn't exactly answer your question sort of deliberately, but I think there are a lot of regional powers in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, and to a lesser extent maybe in Latin America, where as they get better at both offense and defense and they find each other in their networks, I could see that spilling over into traditional, conventional military action.
Thank you. So on this very high and optimistic note, please join me in thanking our speakers.